Hi, welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. And today we have a very important topic we're going to discuss, which is the military and the war in Ukraine. So with that, we're going to bring in our headliner today, who's the former Comptroller General of the United States, to discuss what's going on. We're bringing in the Honorable David M. Walker. David, you have some thoughts on this war in Ukraine. Let's hear it.
Well, thanks, Nick. It's good to be with you. What I would respectfully suggest, let's start off with a reprise of what I said many months ago about what I think Putin's objectives might have been with regard to this war. And they were as follows. One, topple the government in Kyiv and put in a friendly government to Russia, but do not take over the entire country, because that would not give him a buffer from NATO. Secondly, take over large parts of eastern Ukraine and create a land bridge between Russia and Crimea. If we looked at what's actually happened, his objectives to take over large parts of northern Ukraine and Kyiv failed. And so then he redeployed his troops to focus on eastern and southern Ukraine and to create that land bridge. And where we are right now is an absolute stalemate. And the real question is, where do we go from here? And what are the objectives of Ukraine? I know that they've said publicly that they want all of their territory returned, including Crimea. And while that's a laudable objective and understandable, they would say that, I think it's unrealistic that they're going to get Crimea back, because there's a backstory behind Crimea. And the backstory is that allegedly Yeltsin turned that back over to Ukraine at a moment when he was in a drunken stupor, which quite frankly happened quite frequently, I understand, with Yeltsin. And so, we'll see. I mean, we have to figure out where are we going from here. And again, what are Ukraine's objectives? I'd be interested in what Sasha or you or others might have as to what Ukraine's objectives are. Then we can end up, talking about various issues, including not just Ukraine, but what are the lessons from Ukraine for other parts of the world, including Taiwan? And what about what happened this past weekend in the United States, where the U.S. took down a spy balloon, and what are the implications there?
Okay. Yeah, we're going to bring in some of our panelists. First of all, we'll bring in Sasha Starr, who used to live in Odessa, also heads up our TV show, Russia, China, Ukraine, which is broadcast out of Kyiv, Ukraine. And also John Lockwood, who Dr. Lockwood is also a subject matter specialist in U.S.-Russian relationships. And actually, he lives in your area of the world. He lives up in the Washington, D.C. area. So, wait, I shouldn't tell people.
Our home is classified. It's classified.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you want it classified. Otherwise, you don't know who's going to find you. So I guess we'll start with Sasha, because you've been following this war pretty carefully, Sasha, since it started almost a year ago. And what are your thoughts about where are we going from here?
Okay, one important correction. David, it was not Yeltsin who gave Crimea to Ukraine.
Khrushchev.
It happened Khrushchev in 1954. It was they were celebrating 300 years of Ukraine joining Russia, which is absolutely fictitious story, which is absolute lie, 100%. However, that's what they're teaching in school to all the Russian school children. And by the way, so when that happened, Yeltsin was a schoolboy going to school in the city of Yekaterinburg, now Yekaterinburg, formerly Sverdlovsk. Now, what Ukrainians want, and also I would like to elaborate on what Putin wants. Ukrainians want very simple thing. They have sovereign state since 1991, and there are certain borders which are universally and internationally recognized, and all Ukrainians want is to get Russian occupiers out of their country. Full stop, period. That's all what they want, nothing more. They don't want to invade Moscow or St. Petersburg or take over all Russia and so on. Russia is a completely different story, which I'm coming to now. What really now, it's very important thing to understand what Putin wants and what Russia wants. There are two completely different and opposite things. Russia doesn't want anything. They want to live their life as they used to live for the last 800 years. They don't want anything from anybody, and that's all what there is to it. Now, on the other hand, Putin really wants, he's fighting now for his place in history for next 1500 years. And for that, he wants to go into history as a unifier of all Slavic lands. And also he wants to reestablish the Russian or formerly Soviet Empire. And one thing is obvious, whether you listen to Brzezinski or Bismarck, or it doesn't matter who, that without Ukraine, there is no such thing as Russian Empire, period, full stop. So now what to do? So to recreate the Russian Empire, Putin needs to take Ukraine, not just South Ukraine or Eastern Ukraine or just Crimea. He needs all Ukraine. Here is what's the most important thing to Putin. The problem is that the establishment of Russian and Ukrainian people, but to him Russian people, much more important, was happening 1,000 years ago in Kievan Rus. It was Kiev Rus. The Moscow hasn't even existed at that time. So all the Slavic civilization came over in Ukraine, in Kiev, not in St. Petersburg, which was established several hundred years later, not Moscow 300-400 years later. No, it was Kiev, it was Kievan Rus, where today Ukrainian Republic is. And without Ukraine and without that part of the story, what is Russia actually? It's Asian country which was ruled by Mongols for 250 years. There was not even a country existed at that time. What existed at the time was so-called Ulus Juchi. Juchi was the eldest son of Genghis Khan. And that was that country all about. So it is later on when finally Mongols disappeared for their own problems. So finally Russia started to establish as an independent state, but all the fixtures of the government, the way Russia was governed, was Asian, not European. They never had Renaissance. They never had anything what distinguishes Europe from barbarians. So Russia is definitely Asian, barbarian state, and that what is distinguished from Ukraine, which was always part of Europe. Ukraine is a European state. It was part of Lithuanian and Polish Union for a few hundred years. It was always integrated with Europe. In Kiev, all the princes and princesses, they intermarried the people, the royals from Denmark, from England, from many other European countries. So this is with Putin is well aware of all that, and he understands that if Ukraine is part of Russia, then he can use unified history and say, yes, this is a history of Russian people. It started in Kiev, then it migrated further on, and so on. So Russia is a part of Europe. It's part of world civilization, and so on. Without Ukraine, he is unable to do it. He is a ruler of Asian barbarian state. Full stop, period.
Yeah, Sasha, that's really interesting. Thank you for that background and the clarification also with regard to Crimea. I appreciate that very much.
No problem.
Let's focus on where is it now, which is basically a stalemate. and where do we go from here? So I agree with you about what Ukraine wants. They just want Russians out of all of their territory. It's understandable, right? But the real question is, where do we go from here? And one of the latest things that we've heard mentioned was that there are some countries that are calling to admit Ukraine to NATO immediately, which I think is not realistic, but nonetheless, some are calling for that. And as you know, in order to be admitted, it has to be unanimous. And I can think of several countries that may not go along with that. But if that happened, that would basically pull NATO into this conflict with a direct confrontation with Russia. And I just don't see that happening. But I'd be interested from others that are on the.
We'll go to Dr. Jonathan Lockwood, who actually wrote a book in this area, the Soviet view.
Yeah, Russian view of U.S. strategy.
Strategy, right. And let's listen to see what Dr. Jonathan Lockwood has to say.
Well,
Who's a subject matter expert on Russia and Washington, D.C. Yeah.
David, based on the research that I had done previously, one of the things that is a very dangerous indicator is that when the Berlin Wall fell and the West Germans went into East Germany, they discovered the Warsaw Pact's war plans for war against NATO. And Lothar Ruhl, a journalist at the time, wrote in looking at the war plans that as late as 1989, the Warsaw Pact's war plans called for the use of up to 300 nuclear weapons in the initial phases of a war against NATO. In other words, there was not going to be a conventional phase, as many in the West thought there was going to be. Instead, the Russians would have gone nuclear from the outset, which would, of course, gone right to World War III. The problem here is now that virtually all the Warsaw Pact's former members are part of NATO, they are fully aware of these former Warsaw Pact war plans, and essentially, if Russia were to find itself going to war against NATO, my assessment is they've simply dusted off the old Warsaw Pact war plans, and they would go nuclear against NATO. No ifs, ands, or buts, because then it's a war of survival. And now, if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, and it becomes a Russia-NATO conflict, the risk of nuclear escalation goes up quite a bit.
I agree. How about others?
Sorry, I'd like to mention actually that you're absolutely right. There are some countries that want Ukraine immediately to become a member of NATO. Some other countries who are sort of more skeptical about that and actually afraid of that exactly happen. But there is a third plan, is to create a new organization. You can call it Super NATO, or you can call it any other way, which will include the most staunch supporters of Ukraine. To name just a few, it's going to be US, UK, Germany, Baltic states, Poland. That's about it. Maybe a few more countries will find. Actually, probably Holland would join, and so on. So these countries are more homogeneous and have a more united foreign policy, and including one for Ukraine. Now, speaking about nuclear options, which we discussed many times on our Ukrainian program, I've just discovered in the last couple of days very interesting thing, that if you take most of the nuclear weapons, they're based on either isotope of uranium, I think 239, and plutonium. And the length, how long you can store that materials so they could still be used, they're not that great. The plutonium is 18 years, and uranium 239, I think, 235 rather. I think that one is only 30 years. So if you remember that the Russians haven't used any bombs, nuclear bombs, just to test them. Not even a lot of observers, actually, they're not sure that most of their arsenal is still in a position to be used. Not that we would like to try them and figure out whether actually they could be used or not. I'm not saying that. There is another problem for them using nuclear weapons is the chain of commands that has to go through. And except Putin, most of these people, they have families and they want to leave. Even some Putin himself apparently wants to leave and to live as long as possible. He's taking very good care of himself personally from many points of view. So it's not just me, but a lot of people who are following these developments, they're quite skeptical on the ability of Putin actually successfully use nuclear option. That's for sure. And finally, I'd like to mention is 3 generations of people in the West and United States, of course, they live in a threat of Soviets and now Russians using nuclear threats. And finally, right now, there is a possibility without risking a life of a single American or NATO soldier, with just brave Ukrainian soldiers just supplying them some weapons and financial help to get rid of this menace once and for all. It's very close. So if you will take, we're talking about Putin's motives, we were talking about Ukrainian motives, but I think we have to discuss also Western motives, American motives. Why to help Ukraine? Why is it so important now to do? Right now, not in 5 years or 25 years, right now. And I think Biden and his government, they're not doing a very good job at explaining really why is it so important.
Let's remember the signatories of the Budapest Agreement. They were Russia, UK, and United States, who agreed that if Ukraine turned over their nuclear weapons, that they would provide security. But when Russia moved into Crimea in 2014, nothing was done. And yes, the West is helping Ukraine now, but if you want to deter conflict, you need to do things before the invasion, not after the invasion. And let me remind you that with regard to countries that are providing military and financial support to Ukraine, that based on the latest numbers that I've seen, the U.S. has provided about 3 times as much as everybody else combined. And the countries that are providing relatively more as a percentage of their GDP are the Baltic countries and Poland, which one can understand, and the UK. The UK has stepped up. But what about Germany? What about France? What about Italy? What about other countries that are close to the border of Ukraine? And it's just hard for me to see how, whether it's NATO or whether it's some other organization, how there's going to be a commitment to commit U.S. and NATO troops directly in the conflict. But let's get back to where we started. How does this end?
That's a good question. We'll bring in Dr. Dan Worthington. Maybe he has a way out of this particular jam. Dr. Worthington.
It's a very difficult situation. The Russians have put themselves into a corner, diplomatically and militarily. I think part of the problem is the way the United States has approached this. Not that the United States are the bad guys. The Russians are clearly the aggressors. They shouldn't have gone in. They shouldn't have done what they did. I understand what they're trying to do. Putin is seeking the glory days. It's not going to happen. They're not strong enough. Nuclear war would be their only option, and that's not an option because that would be mutual assured destruction. I don't care how deep they put their bunkers. The thing that the United States would have been better off strengthening Ukraine prior to the war, and plus encouraging Ukraine to be more like Switzerland rather than NATO. Because here's the thing, by keeping world parity politically and economically, that encourages peace, right? In the Arab Accords, Abraham Accords, they figured that out. Why should we be fighting each other when we could be benefiting economically by working together and cooperating? Well, Russia isn't, well, they are stupid because of what they've done, but Russia needs Ukraine in order to be economically viable in the future, right? They don't need to take it. They should have worked with the U.S. and other folks to make Ukraine Switzerland because of the resources and everything that are there. And so what have they done instead? They put a chokehold. They've destroyed the grain production. They've done all these things, which is absolutely against their best interest and the best interest of the world, and put the world at peril because of their short-sightedness, because Putin thought he'd be able to make quick work of this. He can't make quick work of this. Somehow they got to get back to Switzerland. I don't know how they're going to do it.
I think there is another vision of Ukraine, is that Ukraine, as a result of what's going on now, Ukraine is already today, as we speak, is the second strongest army in the world after US. Obviously the strongest army in Europe. It's much stronger than England, UK, Germany, France, or Italy, never mind many other insignificant countries. So in fact, the Ukraine is the best guarantee for the all Europe, including Baltic states and Romania and Moldova and Poland and many, many others, being so strong and so well equipped. Remember, Putin made an ultimatum to West in December that we are going to make sure that you have to get all your armies out of Eastern Europe to the NATO border of 1997 and all the other garbage, whatever he said at the time. So now he's complaining to his people that, well, look, we are not fighting Ukraine, we are fighting NATO. And finally, he's right, 100% about it. Today, Ukraine is a NATO army with all the ways to fight. They were very well trained to fight in small groups and using GPS and other technologies. They're getting all the latest weapons now from the West, and I wouldn't be surprised if the next step will be F-16 fighters, and Ukraine will have overwhelming advantage over Russian army. So if Russia is so much down, that's so much beneficial to the West and US, that the Russia is a menace to the world for the last 60 years or more, finally is being stopped and checked by nobody else but Ukraine, without risking a life of any US or NATO soldiers. Unlike us in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam or whatever, here no US life is at risk. So what are you fighting with yourself while being as Russia is being destructed economically, politically, militarily? And this is something what West was dreaming for the last, I don't know, I think since 1917, when there was a Bolshevik revolt in Russia. So West was dreaming for all this time now, more than 100 years, for demise of that menace. So finally it's here.
But Sasha, I would respectfully suggest that the problem is not Russia. You said yourself, the Russians really don't want this. The problem is Putin. Putin is trying to rewrite history, recreate a Russian empire, and so that I would respectfully suggest that's the problem.
David, may I interject? If you are a good student of history, So you should know that all authoritarian regimes, 100%, if you take Latin America and Africa and just any other part of the world, they were failing once they would lose a war. It's only one condition where they could go down, losing the war. So don't stay on the way of Ukrainians to inflict exactly that. Russia losing the war, Putin is out. And after that, we can come to the meaningful.
I think there's no question that if Russia loses the war, Putin is out. You know, and there's no question about it. The question is Putin going to be out before that? And if so, how?
Yes.
And what is it going to take for Russia to lose the war?
To Ukraine getting all their
wish list. Their wish list.
Well, let's talk about
it. That's going to happen very soon. I think by summer, Ukraine will overtake all its territory from Russians. Russia is just unable to do anything. Okay. Here is, on one hand, you have meat grinder, Heimers, and all other wonderful toys. On the other hand, you have so-called Mobic. Mobic are recently mobilized people without any training, without weapons, just really a meat, a human meat or something, you want to call it. So in a case of a fight between meat grinder and a meat grinder usually wins. I don't remember when meat grinder would lose. So what Ukraine today has a perfect meat grinder. So what they're coming right now, they're not even going to attack. What they're saying now, okay, come on, closer, a little bit closer. Okay, you're just there now. So right now, Heimers, they have, I think, 50 miles range. And now with new bombs, which Ukraine will get in very shortly, now the distance will be 150 kilometers. It's 100 miles. So believe it or not, Russians cannot get any closer to Ukrainian controlled territory than 100 miles. So the meat grinder is getting bigger and bigger, so they can absorb more and more meat. Send us the meat, please.
David, let's talk a little bit about the economics of war in general and the U.S. budget. The U.S. budget is over $800 billion for our military. Russia's like $70 billion. My question, are we getting our bang for our buck, no pun intended, in terms of our military budget? Should we feel safer? Or is our defense system actually, would it be able to stop the nuclear weapons? Or are we just throwing $800 billion away every year? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, we've given Ukraine about $112 billion so far. And so when you look at the 800 plus billion dollars, part of that is for aid that's been given Ukraine and other countries, if you will. Ukraine's not the only country that's getting aid from us, although they're getting the most. I think you have to realize you can't judge our defense effectiveness by how much money we spend on it. I'm on the Defense Business Board, and I can tell you that there's absolutely no question that we could reduce projected defense spending and not compromise national security if we fundamentally reassessed the current and future threats and repositioned our strategy based upon that, and if the Congress quit micromanaging the Defense Department budget. Because the truth is, and I'd be interested in what others have to say about this, the real threat is not Russia. My concern about Russia is, will they use tactical nuclear weapons? In other words, battlefield nuclear weapons. I don't think they'll use strategic weapons. I'm still concerned about the tactical weapons, all right, in order to avoid defeat. But if you look at the real threat is China and that part of the world, okay, and the Taiwan situation and what may end up happening with regard to Taiwan. You've got total visibility of the battlefield now. The only thing that you don't have total visibility of is under the water, and yet that's expanding to where there is more visibility under the water. We've got to rethink how do we need to structure our forces based upon that fact? There's going to need to be more unmanned vehicles. There's going to need to be more smaller and more mobile things. We're going to need to redeploy to the Pacific rather than as much with regard to Europe. But then the problem you have is that when you talk about weapon systems, there's a 4-letter word. It's called jobs. And the Congress doesn't want to close bases. The Congress doesn't want to curtail certain weapon systems, even though they may be more expensive than they should be, and even though they're of questionable value. I remember when I was Comptroller General of the United States, the F-35 was going to cost us $35 million a copy. Now it's 100. I remember when we got the F-22, it's going to be $250 million a copy. And now people are questioning whether we ought to keep them. It hadn't been that long ago. And so I think, you can't just go by the number. And we need to do a hard scrub of our defense strategy and our defense budget, because it's not going to be off the table when the crunch comes and we have to make the tough financial decisions.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I agree that we need to reassess our vulnerabilities around the world. You can bet that our opponents are. The Chinese are. The thing that helps us is our technological strategic advantage, but the Chinese are cutting away and eating away into that technological strategic advantage, and to the extent that they aren't, they're stealing our technology all the time because that's what they do, and then they re-engineer everything, or they come up with better technology. They're very, very creative, and I agree with Dave. They are the primary threat against the United States, and they're unpredictable. Ultimately, their goal, though, is world domination. We know that. They have acknowledged that. They want to destroy the United States. They want to change or take us over and dominate us in one way or another. I mean, it's no secret, right?
But Dan, let's face it, the United States will never be conquered from the outside.
It can be conquered from the inside because
no, we're in agreement. Okay, I mean, it'll never be conquered from the outside because one of our biggest protections is the Second Amendment to the Constitution. Nobody in their right mind is going to try to invade.
Dave, you remind me of what Admiral Yamamoto said when he was after Pearl Harbor, when he was asked about invading the United States. He said, "I would never invade the United States. There would be a rifle beneath every blade of grass." And that was in 1941.
Right, and it's much more so now. And remember the movie Red Dawn. Okay, so right. I'm not worried about us being invaded. Nobody in their right mind would do that. Our biggest challenge is ourselves.
Right.
If we fail, it's because we did it to ourselves. Okay, let's look at this Chinese balloon that just came over, and I can stay a little longer. Okay, I think they were doing two things. They were testing our resolve.
Yep.
And they're testing our response time.
That's right.
On resolve, you can say we demonstrated some resolve, but why did we demonstrate resolve? We demonstrated it because it became public. I was in the Pentagon 3 days last week for defense meetings, and I became aware of this the same day the president did, and he made his decision. All right. But that was when it was over Montana. It had been over the Aleutian Islands in Alaska well before that.
It should have been taken down then.
Right. So the bottom line is that we demonstrated some resolve, but our response time was poor.
The biggest threat to the United States from a thermonuclear perspective is the Russians or the Chinese or whoever delivering an EMP device over the United States and exploding it, blinding us and destroying our technology, and then keeping us from being able to have a responsive strike capability. That's always been the problem.
EMP.
Yes.
EMP.
What? Right.
EMP. Yeah.
What Biden administration has done, and any other administration that allows something like that to happen, is pure and absolute negligence. From a defense standpoint, why in the hell let a China launch anything over our? So unless they knew that it didn't have a nuclear device on it, there's ways to tell. But it certainly was an act of aggression on the part of the Chinese. It was done deliberately. There's absolutely no question in my mind. Dave, you're absolutely right. They did a similar thing in the southern hemisphere. There's another balloon going there. So this was not an accident. And they must think we're stupid to think that, well, they do. They think we're stupid.
I do think that's right.
And maybe Biden is. I don't know. Supposedly during the Trump administration, they told the same stuff, right? But I don't know the truth of that or what happened before. But you're right. We need to be able to respond and be able to respond more decisively and quicker to things like that, so that we know that we can, if we have to. Back in the 70s, in the early 80s, the Russians pulled the same crap. They deteriorated a satellite over North America. You remember that, Dave?
Yes.
And created the same kind of issue. We went to DEFCON 2 because we didn't know it had a nuclear reactor on it. We didn't know what they were trying to do. And so this is a very real issue that needs to be addressed. And so in our technology wish list, we need to have anti-ballistic missile technology and anti-stealth missile technology, hypersonic missile technology. We need to be developing other defense strategies that can take care of these problems immediately. I mean, why in the hell didn't we? I mean, we should. I mean, we have laser. I'm not going to talk about specific technology we have, but we have other technologies that can come to bear in those kinds of things. I think they're trying to see what we would do and what technology would do to knock down the balloon. So he sent an airplane up over the Atlantic too late and blew it out of the sky.
But Dan, I ask you something, but it's now been brought to our attention that during Trump administration, there were 3 such balloons flying.
Oh, I mentioned that.
So what makes sense for Trump who was very much anti-China politics, and he ignored these balloons? And
I don't know the specifics, Sasha.
It also hasn't been verified.
No.
That's an assertion.
Yeah, maybe.
It's
maybe.
not been verified.
Okay.
Of course, that's what they're going to say, right?
The reports I've been getting.
Well, but the problem is it's all partisan, right? I mean, the current administration is going to say, well, this happened in the prior administration, whether it did or it didn't. And the prior administration is going to say, no, it didn't. So, we don't know.
Biden wouldn't know. He was hiding in his basement. How would he know anything?
The reports I've been getting from China, because I do distribute to China now, they're actually waiting for the internal destruction of the American empire, which is what they call us. Okay. And then the emergence of the Chinese empire, which they call themselves. And they believe we're stupid. In other words, they'll even put that on their stuff. Americans are stupid. Americans are behind the times. And that we're eternally going to implode like the Roman Empire did. And the new empire that will govern the world will be the Chinese.
Do you remember the lessons from Rome, which is in my book? Okay. See if this sounds familiar. Rome lasted over 1,000 years, but it fell for a number of reasons. See if these sound familiar. Fiscal irresponsibility, political incivility, decline in moral values, overextended military, and inability to control its borders. Do those sound familiar?
Sound awfully familiar.
Awfully familiar, unfortunately. Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Well, but the thing is, that's the Chinese strategy. The Chinese strategy is, no, we're not going to invade the United States.
No.
We're just going to implode, just like
Well,
Venezuela.
wait. Let's be fair. They are actually invading the United States. They have a presence in every major research university in the United States. They own land around all of our military complexes and developing intelligence and gathering. We let them buy our land. We should not let them buy our land. What we're doing is absolutely stupid because we do not have a defensive strategy or an economic strategy against China that doesn't create And the reason is they have the money to spend, right? And that's our fault too, because we consume their goods and they eat it up and they turn it around and throw it in our face.
Mhm.
Dan, how are we going to stop somebody, whether it's another country or anybody else, and maybe this is for Dave as well, from actually purchasing land? Because I do agree that there is a lot of
Just pass a
Chinese
law
interests
and
that are
prevent it.
in there. But I'm just saying, can that law be passed
They control our
constitutionally?
ports, several of our ports as well. They purchase our ports.
Actually, we do have a Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act called FIRPTA, and they could put some more teeth into FIRPTA to stop the acquisitions of real estate in the United States. The real thing is that the United States is basically asleep to the emergence of China. I mean, their GDP is growing at 8% per year. Ours is a little less
Oh,
than
right now it's
3%.
about right now they're at about 3.5 because they
Well,
lost.
they went down
but
because
but
of
they're
COVID.
still more than us, and
It's still more than us. And the thing is, we have debt problems that they don't have. And so the thing is, what they're waiting for is really the implosion of the American empire. Same to Venezuela, what happened to Rome. They really believe that that's going to happen. in the United States.
Nick, but
You
I
got
know this
people
is
like
I know this
Soros
is an
that are trying to
economic
make that
show and
happen.
everything, but to Dan's point, every city that I know of, I mean, we've got several of them here in Durham. One that I regret to say has closed, even though they were originally from, at least the best I can tell, they're closed because I haven't seen them active for about a week and a half. But they were from, I want to say, mainland China. They might have even been from Peking. Well, no, they weren't from Peking, but they were definitely from China. They were definitely from the Chinese empire, and they were definitely running a restaurant here because it was a husband and her husband, wife, and some of their other family members and everything. But if that's the case, you mean that and like I said, they've left. Maybe they've gone back to China for all I know and everything. But are we saying that we can stop those kind of restaurants and businesses from existing if we put a tighter grip, and are folks going to really want that?
The problem is not the Chinese, the people who are citizens of the United States who have Chinese heritage that own businesses. That's not the issue. The issue is Chinese Communist Party and the companies that they create to own land and assets in the United States. That is strategically stupid on our part.
But Dan, that's what I just said. I just said that these folks were literally from China. I mean, the couple that I'm talking about, they were not Chinese Americans. They were literally from China.
That's a
Just like
restaurant.
my upstairs neighbor is going to college.
I don't
I had
care
a
about a
conversation with him, and he's from China as well.
That's a restaurant. What we're talking
Please.
about is land around military bases, and we're talking about land where they're buying up a lot of our agricultural land. Okay,
And ports.
So things that have strategic significance. Obviously, individual restaurants and things like that don't have any strategic significance.
But also their education system, Dan. And like I said, anybody wants to see it, you just go to a website on Facebook called Understanding China. Okay, their education system is really, they train people to let them know that America's inferior. We hate America, basically. If you want to know who hates America, the Chinese education system is training their Chinese to hate America, and that ultimately they want the downfall of America and the resurgence of the Chinese empire.
Well,
If
yeah,
you
true.
believe me, go to Facebook group. You can sign up for free, Understanding China, and you'll listen to them how they perceive the United States.
Nick,
No question. No
Nick, but
question.
the same thing could be
It's
said
not
about Russia and Russian education system. For Russians, United States is arch enemy number one by far, and they're much more in their education system. They're much more hostile to West and specifically the United States than China, because China has a more commercial approach to the world, and even their wishful thinking about America's demise or so on. Don't forget that their time horizon is usually 500 years. So in 500 years, anything can happen. All this today.
Not 500 years, Sasha.
Well, Sasha, the problem with Russia is I've been banned. Our content's basically banned in Russia now, so I don't get any things going back and
They're
forth.
closing
China,
YouTube.
this
They
is-
are closing YouTube. What do we want from this country? They are completely crazy. They want to come back to the past instead of back to the future. They're going back to the past.
I would have no doubt that the Russians hate us too. The problem is in our American education system, we are, and our media also, David, we are not even alert to the fact we have billions of people that are being trained right now to hate us. It's not even on the radar screen
Including in our own school system.
Yeah,
in our school system. That's what I'm saying. They have
I don't worry about Russia at all, except for their nuclear weapons. They are not a superpower, okay? And they have embarrassed themselves with regard to their military capabilities, with regard to what's going on in Ukraine. You also have to keep in mind that many other countries that have strong militaries, for example, China, they're untested, right? I mean, Ukraine's tested. You know, they've got experience on the battlefield now, and they're showing it, and they're doing an incredible job. The United States, rightly or wrongly, its military has been tested, you know, since 2001, but with Iraq and Afghanistan, and even back in the early 1990s with regard to the first Gulf War. But so, you know, a lot of people have capabilities, but there's a big difference after the first shot is fired.
No, big difference there. But speaking of big differences, I want to come back to the balloon because I'm still trying to understand this spy balloon and everything. Because one of the things that confuses me is that there are tons of balloons that are in the air, whether those are weather balloons, whether those are spy balloons, whether they're party balloons and everything. So is that one of the issues, is that there are so many balloons floating in the sky on a regular basis anyway, that maybe that's why it got all the way from California to North Carolina, is because those things are floating in the air constantly all the time, and they're of different sizes and shapes. But Dave, you were in the government there for a couple of minutes and everything. So is that part of the issue, is the fact that they are such a common presence? It's one thing to see a plane or a satellite. Those are big objects that are, and there are thousands and billions of satellites as well, but definitely balloons, there are hundreds of thousands of those. Because it's such an obvious thing that's in the air.
This balloon was much, much larger than a typical balloon, and it was flying at a much, much higher altitude than a typical balloon.
Okay.
And we knew for a fact that it came from China. All right. And we also knew that it had surveillance equipment on it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the difference is that, look, China, you know, and we and Russia and many countries have satellites that we use for surveillance. I mean, that's common sense. Everybody knows that. That's public knowledge. All right. Mm-hmm. But when you're at 40 to 60,000 square feet and in the atmosphere rather than in space, that's a big difference. And I think the thing that was mentioned earlier, which is very important, the concern is our biggest risk is an EMP, electronic magnetic pulse, right? And how might that be delivered? You know, if you explode a nuclear device, you know, in the atmosphere, it can end up having devastating consequences for our financial system, for our energy system, for everything, right? And so the real question is, what's on this thing? And
does that say,
is it a test for something in the future?
But to that same point, that's where I was going at when I mentioned the people that I knew, and it's not like I know tons of Chinese folks and everything, but can't you say the same thing to some degree about somebody that is owning a restaurant or is taking a school course for Duke? I'm assuming that that's what they're doing, but I don't know that for a fact. They could be spies for all I know, and everything in that nature and everything. So that, while I hear what you're saying is that they could be very mild-mannered and innocent in what they're doing, but I don't know that for a fact.
Well, what we don't want to do is what the United States did in World War II,
the Japanese
Americans.
Right, I agree.
We do not want to stereotype and say just because you're of Chinese heritage that we have to be concerned about you. I mean, that was a scar on this country, just like slavery.
Agreed.
A much bigger scar on this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the thing is, shouldn't the United States, once it entered American airspace, just shot the thing down?
Yeah, it should have been shot down the first time and it was over the Aleutian Islands.
Right.
Okay. And there's plenty of areas in Alaska where there's nobody around.
Nobody there. Right. And the thing is, what wasn't China looking at? They're testing our response rate, which seems to me to be pretty bloody slow. Yeah. Because the minute it hit U.S. airspace, it should have been shot down.
Well, they had to wait for Biden to wake up.
Yeah, Biden had to wake up. All right.
Then he had to drop off his bicycle.
Okay, 40 to 60,000 feet. You know, there are airplanes right now in the U.S. that we actually fly at that level. You know, I've been on planes that
22
go up to that
can
long.
get pretty close. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really thrilled with a Chinese balloon floating around in U.S. airspace. So we should have reacted a lot quicker. And the minute it hit the Aleutian Islands, bang, it goes. Because other than that, we're sending a message to China that, hey, we may or may not respond whenever. And it could have implications as to Taiwan.
Well,
I also think the reason why Putin invaded Ukraine was how we dealt with Afghanistan.
Right.
no, absolutely, no question.
No
Let's
question.
go back
When
to
you
what I
show
said.
weakness, hey, these people don't like us. You show weakness to us, they
Yeah.
will hit
It
you.
wouldn't have happened if Trump was president.
Well, let's come back to where I started with regard to this balloon. I said I think they were testing two things. They were testing our resolve, and they were testing our response time.
Yes,
You can
it's
say,
a trial balloon.
you can say that we demonstrated some resolve, but our response time was terrible. And the real question is, had this not become public, would we have done the same thing?
Probably.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, it was a trial balloon by China. If you think,
No
think
pun intended.
no pun intended. Right. This was a
What do
trial.
you think, Dr. Lockwood?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Okay. As I step into the middle of a food fight. In any case, one of the things that I've discussed frequently with Sasha is that because Russia has been placing such an emphasis, and to a certain extent, China, they place a great deal of emphasis on the value of their nuclear weapons arsenals as means not only of great power status, but also as means of potential leverage. Putin miscalculated in thinking that his nuclear arsenal gave him leverage and freedom of action to undertake an offensive against Ukraine. He has miscalculated on several levels. And the intermediate and long-term response, you note that we have been sending ballistic missile defenses to Ukraine with very significant successful effect. And anytime that you introduce ballistic missile defense into the equation, especially for national missile defense as well as intermediate theater defense, you introduce uncertainty into the mind of your opponent as to how successful an all-out strike will be. They don't really know how many of their missiles will get through a full-scale missile defense. They don't know which ones will get through. What they do know is if their full-scale strike, especially a nuclear strike, fails to achieve its objectives, they will be subjected to an overwhelming nuclear counterstrike on the part of the US and NATO. So ballistic missile defense, from my perspective, and from my perspective, my research, is the intermediate and long-term response to develop a global ballistic missile defense system designed to neutralize, with the objective of neutralizing the nuclear arsenals of Russia, China, and by extension, other rogue nuclear powers. And this would entail an upgrading of the U.S. Space Force. Right now, the U.S. Space Force consists of 80 satellites, according to the open media. From the Russian and Chinese perspectives, particularly the Russian, that's not a Space Force. That's a set of 80 targets waiting to be struck. And that is why they have significant counterspace capabilities. The long-term, the U.S. should be adopting what I call a strategia asymmetricheskaya reagирования, strategy of asymmetric response. Do not respond directly, tit for tat, weapon for weapon. You respond with a strategy that is designed to nullify your opponent's strategy. And the Russians very clearly fear, more than anything else, they fear the potential of American technology to neutralize the Russian nuclear arsenal, the very symbol of its great power status. Yeltsin said in 1994, the only reason Russia, in a speech to the Russian Duma, the only reason Russia is considered a great power is because its armed forces have nuclear weapons.
That's correct.
You neutralize the nuclear arsenal, you neutralize Russia. You neutralize their great power status. You render them, in their eyes, worse than destroyed. You render them irrelevant.
Dr. Lockwood, I'll tell
you what I really feel. Okay.
No. I think that if you think that that's all the Space Force is doing technologically, I think there are things that they're doing that we have no clue of.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
So should we now?
And the Space Force, if it in fact goes to a manned space fleet, which, by the way, would be much more effective as an anti-ballistic missile capability, because if you put lasers on satellites, satellites don't have mothers. Destroying a satellite is not an act of war. Destroying a U.S. Space Force starship armed with lasers and people on board, yeah, that's an act of war. You put manned Space Force Space Fleet ships in orbit armed with lasers that are designed to shoot down nuclear weapons in their boost phase, that's a hell of a lot more effective. And it introduces a great deal more uncertainty into the minds of Russian and Chinese planners.
Right.
That is how you pay very careful attention to what they fear. They fear, if anything, the potential of American technology if properly applied. They have been scared, for example, of the Patriot. The Russians have been spooked about the Patriot system, of all things, since 1985. My brigade commander in 1985 asked me to look at Russian military journals and say, what are the Russians saying about Patriot? So I looked at the January 1985 issue of Vestnik Protivovozdushnoye Oborony, Herald of Anti-Aircraft Defense, and there was an article on U.S. high to medium altitude air defense systems. The last third of the article was talking about Patriot. And the author described Patriot as a PRO, Protivoraketnoye Oborony, anti-missile defense system designed for the strategic defense of the United States. We had no such plans, at least as far as I know, but it showed the degree of Russian fear of the U.S. potential of technology. They saw Patriot as the leading edge of the Star Wars program of SDI. They were
Jonathan,
wrong.
but you remember when Gorbachev came to power, he was advised by his own people from army
Correct.
that we don't have anything that much even close the Patriot systems and all Star
Correct.
Wars concepts.
Yes,
And this how
The
Gorbachev
KGB sent Gorbachev a report in April 1985 saying that the U.S. SDI program would eventually be able to neutralize 90% of Soviet missiles in a first strike, and there was no way they could keep up with that capability. Now, mind you, we didn't think it could do that, but the Russians believed it, and they acted on that belief, and they spent themselves into bankruptcy trying to counter a phantom SDI program.
And with that, we're at the hour, so we do want to thank all of our panelists and the Honorable David M. Walker. And stay safe, everybody, because I think this is a real threat, and the United States is ignoring it. So we need to take a look at it. We'll see you next week on Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.